Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Field. I'm the director of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. I'm so grateful that all of you have joined us for this afternoon's discussion on fire and the future of California's forests. As all of you know, there's probably no topic that's more central to the future of the state, to the future of the state policymakers, and to the sort of essential features of being a Californian. Obviously, last year's horrific wildfires brought the topic into focus, but it's likely to become more and more important as time goes along. And one of the things that we would love to do in a conversation with all of you over the next hour and a little bit is talk about where we're headed in the future and how we can be smart about being prepared for the changes that can't be avoided, and how we can minimize the detrimental changes that come as a consequence of the combination of climate change and continuing development in the state. So what I'd like to do today is first introduce our keynote speaker, Assemblyman Bill Quirk. We'll bring the panel up, have a short presentation from each of the panelists, a few questions from me, and then a chance for all of you to be involved in a conversation. And I hope that by the time we finish this afternoon, each of you will have felt that you've had a chance to have all of your questions answered. So it's really a thrill for me to introduce Bill Quirk, who's the member of the State Assembly from Hayward, the 20th District. He's a distinguished career in the State Assembly, following a long career in the Hayward City Council. But the reason, and has made a big difference in environmental legislation in the last several years. But the reason I'm especially impressed to be able to introduce Bill Quirk is he's a climate scientist. And the very first climate paper that really got me excited about climate science, deeply classical, is called Drought in the Sahara, a biogeophysical feedback mechanism. It was published in 1975 by the founding icon of climate science, Jewel Charney from MIT, Peter H. Stone, and William J. Quirk, who, as my understanding, added the physics horsepower in order to make this calculation work. And we're incredibly fortunate to have in the California legislature, one of the pioneers in climate science. This paper in Science really was the first time that there was a demonstration that changing the vegetation on the Earth's surface could change the climate. And maybe Bill will tell you about the specifics of this paper, but the climate model simulation that they did was that if you've got a forest in the Amazon or in the Sahara and you cut it down, what happens to precipitation? And they showed that even if you have a regime that provides sufficient precipitation for a forest, once it's cut down, you no longer get that precipitation, and the forest influences the rainfall. And so that's the science story that brought me into climate change research, and it's a thrill for me to be able to introduce Bill Quirk, who was responsible for making that story possible to tell. So, Bill.
It's hard for me to believe, but that paper is still quoted today. So I have a PhD in astrophysics. I actually did the first calculations where you had a gas cloud that turned into a spiral galaxy. And then later on, when the emphasis changed to taking a look at weather and climate at NASA, I got involved. And Jewel Charney always had great ideas, and I was the one who wrote and ran the computer codes, wrote the work up, but he was he really taught me all I knew about climate science. So he was a great mentor, and just taken from us too soon. Anyway, what's going on here in California? So I'm assuming I'm talking to an audience here who is pretty aware of the fact that we had these terrible fires in Northern California that caused record numbers of deaths, and also, importantly, record amount of damage. Over $10 billion, maybe $15 billion, we're still adding it up. And this is an area where there were similar fires in the 60s, but nobody lived there. And now we have all of these people living on the urban forest interface. And that's why this fire was so expensive and took so many lives. And people had just forgotten what had happened 50 years ago. Not that far, but it wasn't particularly remarkable then. It was very remarkable now. So that's one of the most important things that we have. The other thing is to realize that while current fire codes, at least according to the insurance industry, have said that the new homes that we're creating are really pretty fire resistant. They have sprinklers, they have roofs that aren't going to catch fire, you don't want to have wooden decks, all of these things. Most of the homes are before that went into effect. So our problem is dealing with these older homes, not that old, but older than the current codes, building codes, that are still in this interface and that are going to be subject to being burned. The other factor that is really important is instead of having 30 old trees per acre, we have hundreds of young trees, brush, etc., because we haven't allowed fire to clear them out. And again, I'm sure you're all aware of that. Well, given that the problem that we're having is in this urban forest interface, what are you going to do about it? Are we going to, as a state, spend the money and time to clear that out? There's also the issue of how these fires start. And part of that is we have a drought, we have warmer temperatures, which mean even if you got the same rainfall, the forest would be that much drier. And of course, fires that are prepped, not for small fires, but for large fires. So these are all things that we have to worry about. And there gets to be more. So in the case of the 2017 fires, before anyone knew what caused the fires, everyone was suing PG&E. And why was that? Well, it turns out that according to an interpretation of the state constitution, if a public entity, and starting in the 90s, they decided that the investor-owned utilities were public entities. Starting in the 90s, they said, well, if there's a fire caused by your lines, whether it's your fault or not, we call this, we're going to hold you responsible for all damages. This is called inverse condemnation. And the judge said, in the case of public entities, and this is something that's been interpreted in the Constitution for a long time, the taxpayers can pay for this. And the thought is, if you build a bridge and for whatever reason this causes a shoreline to erode, then you should pay that owner. I mean, this was a public good, that bridge. You can raise taxes. This was before Prop 13. This is the Constitution from 100 years ago. You can raise taxes. You can reimburse that property owner. And then, as I said, in the 90s, this was interpreted to include the investor-owned utilities, because after all, they could charge the rate holders. The problem with this is that no one thought, so that's why they're suing PG&E, even before they know what caused the fire, because if they could show PG&E caused it, they don't have to show negligence. They can just show that they caused the fire, and then PG&E, then they have an automatic case. They don't have to go to court to prove it. They don't have to prove negligence, which would be the other way to do this. They can just say PG&E pays. Well, when it's $10 to $15 billion and there are 5 million PG&E customers, that means $2,000 or $3,000 per customer, which is a lot of money. Now, many say, well, PG&E, they should just pay for it. And the difficulty here is that they shouldn't go to their rate holders. After all, what we heard from the head of the Public Utilities Commission is we have a guideline here that's many years old that basically says the utilities are negligent unless it can be proven otherwise. So it's very hard under those circumstances to prove you're not negligent. Well, in that case, the ratepayers don't pay, but PG&E has to. Well, if it's $10 to $15 billion, that's a lot of money. Case of PG&E, about when the San Bruno fire and explosion came up, there was a year-long proceeding which said, we can fine PG&E $2.5 billion. More than that, and they go bankrupt, and we may not get anything. And then the rest was paid for by the ratepayers, any other additional damages. So maybe PG&E could pay $3 billion. It's not clear they could pay 10 or 15. If they go into bankruptcy, it's not clear anything's paid. And the reason this is important is with $10 to $15 billion in damage, many of those structures were either uninsured or underinsured. So how do you help these people out who are uninsured or underinsured? Many people, and you got to do this, look at your homeowner's policy and make sure your replacement value is up to date. And find out what it costs to rebuild a home in your area and make sure you're insured for that. And if you haven't done this in the last few years, do it now. Anyway, so the point is here, you want to help these people. PG&E might be found guilty of having started the fires. We don't know. If they were, it's a bill that they probably can't afford to pay. If they weren't, how do you help the people who have been damaged by this? And this is something that we have a special working group on, trying to figure out how do we help these people rebuild. And of course, if they do rebuild, trying to get them to rebuild in a way that respects the environment they're in. Probably making sure they're not in the middle of the forest, which means cutting things back, which they won't like, and making sure that they're up to the current codes. And what do you do about the older homes who are in this interface that aren't up to current codes? These are many things that we worry about. I do have some legislation working on this. I can't say that it's just right now we just have what we would call placeholders so we can figure out what can be done. And if anyone here has any great ideas about what should be done, let me know. So there's a lot of things going on here, but I think I've created a broad enough picture. So we're not talking just about fire and the damage it does to the forests. We're talking about the damage it does to people, the deaths that come out, the difficulty of rebuilding, the problems that happen to cities with their infrastructure, and a possibility that, in fact, will cause the ratepayers of PG&E to have to come up with that money. Is that the right way to handle fire insurance for wildfires? All sorts of questions are coming up. So what I'm trying to say here is the problems of wildfires are causing a lot of hurt to people. The people who are hurt, and then if we reimburse them, how do we not hurt other people? And I would say that's the conundrum that we face in the Assembly and Senate and with the governor right now. PG&E, because they might be liable for more than they can afford, it's now costing them twice as much to borrow money. Instead of roughly 3%, it's roughly 6%. All of that is paid for by the ratepayers. There is no, well, it goes on and on. And I really wish I knew the answer. I wish I could tell you the answer, but I can't, and I'd be glad to hear from any of you who can. Thank you.
You want to just take a... Thank you, Bill. It's a wonderful introduction to emphasize the point that wildfires aren't just about the forests. It's about the forests, the economy, and the people. And that's very much the theme that we'll be taking up in the rest of today's conversation. I want to introduce our three panelists, and we'll start off with a couple of questions. So closest to the screen is Professor Noah Diffenbaugh. He's the Kara J. Professor of Earth System Science and the Kimmelman Senior Fellow in the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. Noah's a distinguished climate scientist, and he's really been a pioneer in understanding the role of climate change in extreme events, and is really led not only the technology development for being able to do this, but also the studies of attribution of particular extreme events, and including some of the extremes we've seen in California. Next to him is Ben Bryant, who's an economist with a joint appointment between the Natural Capital Project and the Water in the West program at Stanford. He's interested in economic valuation of ecosystem services and being able to translate the way forests work, what they do, into the real services that are provided for not only ecosystems, but also for people and economies. And then third from the screen, close to me, is Dr. Kari Nadeau, who's I hope I get this right, the Nadisi Foundation Professor of, this is the world's longest title, Food Allergy, Immunology, and Asthma at Stanford, and she is also the director of the Sean Parker Center for Allergy Research. Kari is one of the world's leading experts in allergies, their causes, and their links to the environment. And so across our three panelists, will go from the physical science of the causes of fires through the natural processes into the implications for humans and what we can do about it. And if I can start out with a question for Noah, tell me where things are in our current understanding of the role of humans in the extreme events we're seeing and what we expect in the future.
So the short answer is, we now have clear evidence that humans are influencing extremes around the world. We've of course known that humans have been influencing the global scale climate for a long time in terms of the energy balance of Earth, the global temperature, that increase in global temperature that we've observed, also called global warming. And what's happened over the last 10 to 15 years is a real explosion of research focused on trying to understand not only trends in extremes historically, but also the role of global warming in individual events. And California has been a very fertile place to be studying this topic in recent years, partly because we've experienced a lot of extremes, but more importantly because there is so much interest and support. Certainly we've seen in the drought here in Sacramento and around the state a real engagement with people doing the research to try to find solutions. So with respect to fires, wildfires are a great example of extreme events because they result from a confluence of conditions. It's an interesting topic to try to study because, of course, it's not just the sort of physical or biophysical conditions. Humans play a role in fire ignition and in fire risk as well. So it's a great example of how we try to understand the role of different ingredients in individual extremes. So if you think about the fires that happened in California recently, you certainly have the drought certainly is present in terms of all of the trees that died during the drought and the fuel that created. So our research on the drought has shown that how temperature plays a really critical role in drought, and particularly in California, how the warming of California has increased the odds that when low precipitation happens, it coincides with high temperature and eventually produces drought. But then with these fires that we've seen both in Northern California and Southern California, the winds are a critical ingredient as well. And one of the most intriguing aspects to what's happening in California with respect to fire is the way that the warming of California is playing a role in terms of drying out vegetation, increasing fuel aridity, but then also how the timing, right, how the increasing extreme heat in the summer and the fall is affecting the season in which those dry vegetation conditions occur. So one of the things we're trying to understand now is that role of heat and how it intersects with the winds. And I'll close with an analogy that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So we'll see how it does today. But it's a baseball analogy. So in the history of Major League Baseball, or softball for that matter, how many two-run home runs have occurred without there being a home run? None at all, exactly. And how many two-run home runs have occurred without there being a person on base? None at all. All right, so you need two ingredients, right? You need a home run, but you also need someone on base. So even if the rate of home runs is not changing, if the rate of walks is increasing, we can expect to get more two-run home runs, right? And that's basically what we're seeing with the winds and the extreme temperatures. So the winds are complicated, right? They happen every year, but we're definitely seeing a situation where the fuel aridity is increasing. And you can think about that like a team giving up more walks, putting more people on base. When a home run happens, there's more likely to be 2 runs given up rather than 1. So I'm getting a read on the room that was a marginally effective analogy. So I'm going to stop there.
Okay, thank you, Noah. Let me turn to Ben now. In Bill's opening remarks, he talked about what we might think of as the co-disbenefits of having a fire and how the consequences of fire ramify through peoples and ratepayers and companies. And I know a lot of your thinking has gone in the opposite direction. What are the co-benefits of effective management of forest? And how can we think about co-benefits of effective forest management in a fire-prone environment? It's on the top.
Tap it and see if it. No. There you go.
Testing. Still working?
He'll bring it up as soon as you start talking.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So what I would like to talk about is obviously we are aware that fire is a destructive force, but one of the things that is receiving an increasing amount of attention, including from a lot of people in this room, but is not as widespread of a storyline as we would like to see, is that one of the primary actions to reduce large-scale wildfire risk, which is forest restoration, which is essentially reducing the density and restoring forests to something closer to their ecological history through a combination of mechanical thinning and prescribed burning, that action in itself, that change to the landscape, has a suite of benefits to people, which we call ecosystem services, and that what we're trying to do, and a lot of others are trying to do, is quantify and get precise about being able to say what those benefits are, how big they are, and by doing so, bring more people and more funding and more creative thinking to cut through administrative hurdles to the table to kind of get a lot more restoration happening on the landscape. And so just to put everybody on the same page, and then I'll go into some details about water-specific benefits. The suite of benefits that we see include recreation. So by changing the landscape to reduce the probability of mega fires and severe fires, you're creating the likelihood that you're going to preserve a landscape that people actually want to recreate in versus a completely denuded, ash-filled landscape of dead trees. Flood risk is another one where mega fires and extreme severe burning can increase the rate at which precipitation flows off the landscape, both for going into reservoirs, creating potential flood conditions, as well as creating woody debris flows and sedimentation flows that are very difficult and costly for people to remove. It's a surprising amount. Like, people will spend millions of dollars just dealing with dredging sediment because it's coming down after a large fire and then there's been rain and it's been just sending sediment into a crucial afterbay that's necessary to run your hydropower operations. And then getting more, Kari will talk about smoke, of course, which is not good. But getting more specific into the water supply realm, we're actually involved in a couple different projects with organizations like the Nature Conservancy and a group called Blue Forest Conservation, both of which I see here in the room, where we're working in a couple different watersheds trying to precisely understand what happens to water flows when you engage in that forest restoration, and what that does to both the total water supply and the timing of that water flow. And showing that through hydrologic modeling, and also working with water agencies like Placer County Water Agency and others, to show how that change in water flows can affect the bottom line of a utility, and show them that they can see potential benefits from participating in this restoration action. And so what we're finding there, things are still relatively preliminary, but that we're seeing that these water quantity benefits on their own can potentially pay for 10 to 20% of the forest restoration costs, just from the fact that you are able to produce this new water that then will run through turbines and generate valuable hydroelectricity, and potentially also opportunity for water sales in a water scarce environment. And then also at the same time, there's even potential for win-wins for other aspects of the environment. So if you're producing this water, some of it can go towards hydropower, but some of that might also facilitate improving ecological flows. So in the Placer County case, there's a foothill yellow-legged frog that needs a certain pulse flow and ramp down rate coming out of the hydropower plant, and we can hopefully show that you can increase the benefits to that frog and the ecological flows more generally from this upstream forest restoration. So it's an example where the forest condition is affecting kind of aquatic species health. So we're looking at a variety of benefit streams there, and trying, in general, as Chris was alluding to, get very specific on how individual entities or people or groups actually benefit from these interventions, and show that, motivate more people to come to the table to be involved with that. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Ben. And one of the things that I know there are several ARB people in the audience, and they've known this forever, but one of the things that was strikingly brought into focus for me with the fires in the last year has been how the effects aren't just local, that the air quality effects are statewide and really truly regional. And we're really beginning to have some insights into the impacts of that. It's one of the areas of Kari's focus. And I wonder if you can tell us where we are in understanding the impacts of the long-distance transport of the emissions from the fires.
Yeah, I'm very grateful for being here today, and I want to thank Dr. Field and the Woods Institute for inviting me here, because I feel very grateful that a group of committed individuals is going to potentially change how we deal with the California wildfires. And I'm here to really try to think about ways with you to how to mitigate these circumstances. But I would like to talk about the problem first. And we're trying to understand the problem, but we don't have all the facts yet because we need to understand more about it. We need to study this more. But for that we have studied, it is dangerous. There is no safe distance away from a wildfire. And let me explain that to you. We work with University of California, Berkeley Public Health, UCSF Fresno. We've now studied wildfires and their contributions to health. And so we know that the wildfires have gotten worse over time in California. 2017 was the worst on record. 1.4 million acres were burned. And there were some parts of Southern California where 1 acre was being burned per second. Now, why is that important? The smoke flumes, for example, covered 1,000 miles out to the ocean. That's equivalent to New York City to Miami distance. So, for example, when the Napa Valley fires were happening in Fresno, our site monitors on the roof could pick up the compounds that were being emitted in Napa Valley, even though we couldn't necessarily feel it and smell it. The children that we were monitoring, their asthma rates were increasing. So let me give you an example. A publication just came out on the American Heart Association, where in the 2015 wildfires in California, 1.1 million ED visits were assessed. 1 out of 3 visits in the emergency room were due to heart attacks. 1 out of 5 due to asthma. 1 out of 9 due to strokes. That rate of asthma was up by 3-fold compared to seasons when there wasn't a wildfire. The risk of heart attacks increased by 42% in those individuals that were over 65 years of age. That's like smoking a cigarette every year for 2 years. That's equivalent to your rate of increase in your heart attack risk.
A cigarette every day.
Every day, sorry. Cigarette every day for a year.
2 years.
That's 2 years. For 2 years. So
Right.
cigarette every day per year for 2 years is equivalent to that rate of rise in your heart attack risk. So with that in mind, this is dangerous. It's affecting us, sight unseen, short-term and long-term consequences of our health. And I like to think of it kind of 4 major areas that are going to be affected by wildfires. Cancer, because there's volatile organic compounds that come out of emissions through wildfires, through organic compounds called benzopyrenes and other chemicals. The heart is a major organ that's affected, as I just spoke about, increased risks of heart attack. The immune system, because of short-term and long-term consequences of wildfires, it affects the DNA in our immune cells, and they can be affected in the unborn children. We've seen that in some of the pregnant moms down in Fresno, for example, even from the wildfires in Napa. And then finally, the lung. The lung is an incredible organ and has a huge surface area, but wildfires and all of the smoke affects the lung, not just for the things that we can smell, but also long-term consequences, days, weeks, months. So with that in mind, people think that if they shut their windows, if they wear masks, that somehow they won't have to be affected by the health consequences of wildfires, and that's not true. Again, there's no safe distance. Even with rubberized windows, those particulate matters can still get in. And unfortunately, we don't know everything about how the wildfires are going to contribute to health consequences, but they will. And those are just 4 areas that people have studied right now. And there are populations that are going to be at higher risk for developing long-term health problems than others. Children, babies, the elderly, and then people that are dealing with environmental justice and adversity issues and the underserved. So those are just some areas that I'm hopeful that as legislative members move forward, as we can think about laws to protect individuals, that really the best way to deal with the health issues is to prevent the wildfires from occurring in the first place.
Thank you, Kari. And since Bill has agreed to stay on the stage and take questions, it seems really clear that there are important co-benefits of forest restoration, as Ben has already spoken of, and there are profound human health consequences of wildfire exposure if we don't do a good job of in the prevention end. And I wonder if those realizations are sort of finding their way into the policy environment.
Okay. I've been trying for, Tomasa, is it 3 years or 4 years? I've been trying to make it easier, 3 years for prescribed burn. Now, for those of you who are here from the Air Resources Board, ARB, the regional air resources boards don't like prescribed burn for the reasons Carrie's talking about. And I've tried for the first couple of years to find ways to make it easier. The bills fail for one reason or another. The bill I have this year says, all right, regional ARBs, look at the impacts of a prescribed burn versus if you have a wildfire, and compare those and let us know what you find out. And I'm not even sure that's going to pass. The other thing is the area where we get the most damage to people is the area, again, in that urban forest interface. And there you're clearly, what you're going to need to do is a mechanical trimming of the forest, getting rid of the brush, getting rid of the trees. And again, we've been trying to do this for a number of years. And the Nature Conservancy, I'd very much like to meet with you, the people from the ARB, because there are other environmental groups who think anything we do to the forest is wrong. And I'm not going to name names, but again, I heard from an insurance company that was, or insurance organizations, was trying to do more to clear out the forest, and they said they could never reach consensus with the between the foresters who wanted to clear them out and an environmental group that they were dealing with. So we need help if we're going to do these things. And the other thing is I'm listening very closely to what Ben Bryan is talking about in terms of showing benefits. If we're going to be able to do this, we have to show benefits. And by the way, when this thing goes to when any bill goes to the Appropriations Committee, they basically don't look at the benefits. They only look at the cost. But still, it does give you an argument. So they will look at the full cost, and hopefully we could get some money in the budget to do it. The final thing is that we are very dependent on the electricity generating plants that use biomass. And because how are you going to get rid of the forest debris? And they're also very important. There was a time I remember coming up to UC Davis in the 70s when all the ag waste was burning in the fields. And Carrie Nadeau can tell us how bad that was. Well, that could happen again if these plants close. Now, why would they close? It's because of the success of solar energy. There are two problems right now with that. One is these plants are much more expensive than solar energy. So the utilities don't want to buy their power. The other is their base load. That means that they run at the same rate all the time. And as you get more and more solar during the day, you want a source of power that you can turn down. Frankly, that's one of the reasons why nuclear power is not particularly popular in the state. It's all base load. So people ask me, I'm in favor of nuclear power, and they think I'm going to talk about safety. But no, what I'm talking about, that's base load power. And that's the problem we have with those plants. So those plants need to get money for the benefits they do besides creating power. And it would also be good if we could engineer them so that they could go down during the day and up to meet the peak at night. So I really need Ben's help and Carrie's help and Nature Conservancy and people from the ARB if we're going to tackle this problem of making our forests less likely to have wildfires that completely burn out the forest. I mean, in the old days, the few redwoods per acre. Now, with the brush, with the many smaller trees, we just lose everything. And so I need your help. I want to do it. Tomasa Duenas, my chief, is right there in the red dress with the black sparkles, or black, I don't know, whatever they are. Camouflage. She wouldn't show up in a red forest. So, look, I need all your help. I am the only scientist, but we have a Caltech engineer, we have a UC Irvine engineer, we have an MIT engineer, we've got other technical people, and we've got people who will listen to your arguments. And we're going to need your help if we're going to do something about this. Believe me, I can't do this myself. I need help from all of you.
Let me follow up on that with a question about the importance of building coalitions for addressing the issues. And both Kari and Ben spoke about the relevance of multiple stakeholder groups. And maybe you'd like to comment further. I'm impressed with the human health consequences, how the disadvantaged community, environmental justice type perspectives come in. Obviously, the human health perspectives come in. And we have a whole bunch of motivations for taking action on this issue that we haven't necessarily brought into focus in the past. But what do we need to do to bring them more sharply into focus? Kari, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think that going out into the communities, really understanding, in California we have a number of different types of communities and a number of different areas that are affected by wildfires. And we have some critical air basins that have had studies done to show the health outcomes. And those studies have shown that the underserved and certain ethnicities are at higher risk for these health problems, cardiac events, immune issues, children specifically that have been exposed to weeks of wildfires don't have as good vaccine responses. So these things are going to accumulate, and we need to understand how it affects different communities. But what I've been impressed is that communities are coming to the table. We recently had a forum such as this in Fresno in December to say, how did the Napa fires affect us as a community? They wanted to know. So people are stepping up, and focus groups are occurring. Communities want to understand how this is affecting them on the health level, as well as how they can potentially mitigate through actions that they can perhaps move forward within local communities. So I've seen this as a catalyst, and hopefully we can move that forward to be able to affect change.
Thank you. And Ben, I know that both in Water in the West and NatCap, you've put a big investment in bringing together stakeholders with initially different perspectives and using that as a way to explore and unfold the benefits. And what is the next step in capitalizing on the potential benefits to really mobilize attention to the issue?
I think it's actually an area where, so we do a lot of that. I think that's also an area where there's a lot of success happening already with things like the forest collaboratives and groups like the Sierra Nevada Conservancy that are kind of bringing a lot of people together, recognizing that there's forestry has an interest, as do the ecological interests and things like that. Part of what we're trying to do is, I think, just one area that I see that I think there's a lot of groups that are doing kind of a large degree of coordination and engagement, and that we're trying to feed in science there. There's also a lot of groups that are doing what I would call synthesis or synthetic science, where they're bringing the science together in one place to create compelling cases. And there was just a report from the Legislative Analyst Office that did this. But I think there are still some gaps of distinguishing the stories around the high-level narratives about possibilities for carbon sequestration, addressing climate goals, addressing recreation, water quality goals at a high level, and the analysis that needs to be done to demonstrate specific benefits to specific parties. And that's something that we're trying to do through our engagements, and other groups are looking at as well. That as you're trying to, whether it's bring in private finance like Blue Forest Corporation, Blue Forest Conservation is doing, or just get more motivation to remove administrative hurdles through many of the different state and federal agencies. We're all trying diligently to do that. Having kind of quantified benefits that speak specifically to the individual interests of the individual agencies or entities is kind of where I see the key next step. And that's kind of, all of these benefits are so site specific and project specific that you kind of need to find a way to streamline that process.
I'm going to ask Noah one more question, and then I'm going to open it to questions from the audience. So you should think about the question you want to ask. And given the clear motivation for building coalitions to address the risk, I guess the question I have, if I understood the home run analogy correctly, is that the risk is going to be increasing almost independent of the precise nature of the climate changes that occur. And given the way you see the risk profile unfolding, does that just mean we ought to work harder on the fuel reduction and ignition risk reduction, or are there other components that come into focus because of the nature of the changes in the risk?
Yeah, so I think we can take as given that, I'm going to stick with this analogy. We can take as given that there are going to be more people on base. So I think we can take as given that the fuel aridity is going to continue to increase, right? And we've seen that. Multiple studies have shown that how much dry fuel there is on the landscape has increased as a result of human-caused global warming. Right? That we know that throughout the West. In California, during this year, those fuel aridity indicators were at record levels right before Northern California, right before the Northern California fires, and also in Southern California, right before the Southern California fires. And that's mostly related to the increase in heat, and we can expect that the kinds of severe temperature episodes that created the hottest first pitch of the World Series on record, we can expect those to continue. And that means when the time of year when the Santa Ana are blowing, the time of year when the Diablo are blowing, we're more likely to have record fuel aridity during those times now than we used to be, and will be more likely in the future than we are now. And I think we can take that as given. So I think that means that the management decisions, if they're going to be effective, they need to integrate that change in the risk, right? So if we take the perspective that we can make management decisions assuming the way the climate used to be historically, that's not what we're going to get, and those management decisions will not produce the same result in the future as they have in the past. We can expect more years like what we've had recently. So I think how we alter those management decisions is that, just hearing this discussion, that's really a pressing question to me. How do we build those coalitions when different constituencies might, one decision might favor one outcome, another decision might favor the other. So, for example, it strikes me listening to this conversation that once a fire is started, if the management decision is to set a large perimeter, try to contain it, and let it burn in that perimeter, and that might have some of the effect that we heard before of letting the fuel burn out, and that might be healthy from the forest perspective. That might be not as good from a human health perspective. And I don't know what the answer is to how we build coalitions in the face of competing priorities. But I do know that we can expect to be experiencing the conditions that create wildfire. We can expect to be experiencing more severe conditions more frequently as global warming continues to unfold.
Okay, let me open it up for questions, and you can direct your questions to any of the individuals on the stage. We have a couple of roving microphones, and if you wait for a microphone, we'll be able to hear your question, and so will everybody else.
I just had a changing of the guard. Instead of my chief, Tomasa Duenas, I now have my ledge director, Miranda Flores, in the back. And again, anyone who wants to help me solve this problem, please get to Miranda. I'll be in the back too. And I definitely need to get your information as well. So I'm ready to go.
Prescribed burns, you've got that drip torch ready to go, right?
It may or may not be prescribed burns. It could be thinning out the forest and getting and retrofitting the homes that are in that area. Right now, because of the large amount of damage that was done to people, deaths, landslides, we really have to look at this urban-forest interface. We have to make it less likely that the fires will reach this interface, and we have to make sure that the homes that are there will survive, or at least have a chance of survival. And I think we're really focused on that. We're also focused on making sure, we don't know yet whether or not any power lines caused some of this, but it's a likely guess that they did. What do we really need to do to make this less likely? Is anything we're going to do make a difference? We don't know that yet. So there's certainly some things we can do, but how much it'll help, we don't know. So, but we're really focused right now on that urban forest interface.
Let's see if some of the questions can help us zero in on some of the issues. So I saw a microphone over here. And if you would say your name, that'd be great. And where you're from.
Jay Ziegler, Nature Conservancy. Ben, I want to pick up something that you talked about, because I think you hit one of the hardest things that we've constantly found kind of working together across the landscape here, which is who pays for this? And we were, among other partners, Pacific Forest Trust in the room, others that I see here really fought hard at the federal level to drive fire borrowing reform, to direct more resources to management of our national forests. So we have a federal partner now working actively in forest health. The Brown administration has started to move more resources there. We're hopeful that the May revise may deliver additional resources, and Mr. Quirk will actively want to work with you in pursuing those state resources to match the challenge. And then the private part of it and the utility part of it are also critical. And I just wonder, Ben, if you have a sense of, if we get the right equation from the federal government, from the state government in place, you suggested maybe a 20% type of allocation of costs to utilities that benefit. Maybe if you could talk more about other payers that could make the whole equation come together. Thanks.
Yeah. So first, hopefully that number won't be super widely quoted because that's preliminary, but it is right on an order of magnitude. But also, just to highlight, that's specifically just the water quantity benefits. And so there's a lot of things that a utility would have interest in, including risk to recreation facilities and campgrounds and the lands they manage, that doesn't account for reduced debris flow or fire risk to infrastructure or things like that. So I think one of the things that we're doing both with Placer County and with Yuba County Water Agency is trying to get pilots going that demonstrate these benefits are real and that there's an interest in participation. And then as science advances, both on its own in the academy and through specific engagements, working to further understand the actual specific needs of different benefit streams. So utilities are obviously a big beneficiary who, depending on the structure, would potentially pass additional cost on to ratepayers or not, depending on exactly what's being done. And there's been some good legislation like AB 2480, I think, that lets utilities recognize natural infrastructure as part of their balance sheet. So in terms of other payers, so getting there's talk about the insurance industry, which wouldn't necessarily want to pay itself, but has offered in some cases premiums for fire-wise communities that have reduced their fire risk through kind of extremely local home-based management and things like that. So I think in general, it's this issue of how you can find, just pinpoint who those beneficiaries are. The recreationists could be another one, conservationists who have interest, like I was mentioning earlier, in that it's not just the watershed forest condition, but also downstream impacts and water supply and things like that. So it's, I don't have the full laundry list of benefit streams in my head, but utilities are a primary interest, as well as at-risk fire communities potentially have a mix of public and private interest in reducing that risk. So I think that is kind of a policy challenge, is that economists spend a lot of time thinking about who should bear that risk and how you should divide the responsibility for addressing it. And I think some of it should be private, and that might need to be educational, which there is a lot of that already. But so that's not a concise answer, but I think it's widely distributed, and building out from places where there is demonstrated interest to bring in other partners is the way to go. The last one I just wanted to mention is the climate impacts. I think the science is getting close to pretty firm that proactive management, even though you're removing vegetation to begin with, that the net GHG impact of forest restoration is good. And so even though there's a little temporal trade-off, that overall that's better. And so if you can connect into carbon markets and state funds and things like that, that's another major source.
Kari, one of the things that's really clear from your comments is the idea that one of the big sources of savings from better fire policy is avoided health costs later on. And I realize it's not your specialty to think about the economic consequences of that, but do you have estimates of what the savings in health costs might be?
Yeah, I think Bill had mentioned that it has cost the state around 10 to 15 billion, give or take, right? We still are adding up some of the consequences. I'm sure within that are the bills of the emergency room visits. I just gave you out of 1.1 million emergency room visits, 320,000 were probably due to wildfires and some of the health consequences therein. And so when you think of it, that's adding up. And it's also days off from work, days feeling sick, not being able to, even if you're at work, to produce as much. There was a paper that just came out in a journal called Science that Dr. Field had mentioned, Bill had published in, but there is a journal article that came out about the effects of pollution, including wildfires, long-term on the economics, so that the health outcomes are going to affect a productive workforce, are going to affect healthcare costs. And that's important to look at when we think about spending the time and the money now to work with the stakeholders, to work with legislative bodies so that those downstream costs are actually improved upon and decreased, because the health outcomes are costly for healthcare, but then also the days off from work and the productivity in work are affected greatly by wildfires and pollution. So I think if we can get ahead of this, have these difficult narratives now, it's worth it, because the health outcomes and the workforce will be improved.
Thanks. Another question? And if you could wait for 1 second for the microphone. And again, your name.
Great, yeah. My name's Patrick Kopel. I work for the Tuolumne River Trust, and I'm part of a forest collaborative up in the foothills of the Sierra near Yosemite. And I understand the health considerations are, really important, and CARB doesn't like prescribed fire. I just want to make a comment that would appreciate a response from your panelists. I would propose that the title of the briefing might be changed to "Fire is the Past and the Future of California's Forests." These are really fire-adapted forests that, for millennia, have evolved around fire, and we've done a really good job of suppressing fires for the past century nearly, and what we've found is a buildup of fuel and these explosive wildfires. What we really, in my opinion, need to do is get some amount of fire back on the landscape. So to me, you need to look at the two alternatives of controlled fire when you want it, in a manner that you want it, versus an uncontrolled wildfire that you can't control. So I don't know if one of your panelists wants to respond to that.
Please go ahead.
Again, I have a bill to do that. I would very much appreciate if you could come and testify when that bill goes to the next committee. All right? And Miranda is right there. Miranda, put up your hand. She will get your name. And if you can bring the Nature Conservancy and a few others, that will help.
Yeah, but
and in addition, if we can, just talk about as well the health of the forest as well as the health of the people.
But your comment about the way that effective fire suppression has sort of built us into a box that we have to find a way to disassemble is a really important one, and unraveling this issue of whether we can transition to more controlled burns without unacceptable health consequences is really in the crosshairs of what we need to figure out. Question, if you wait for 1 second for the microphone.
Hi, my name is Dr. Amy Horn. I'm a forest ecologist. What the current situation with our forests has convinced all of us, I hope, is that forest ecosystems are dynamic. And it is, as Patrick just said, California is a Mediterranean climate, is an ecosystem that is adapted to fire. And so we have to learn how to live in a fire-adapted ecosystem, which means we have to learn how to live with the disturbances, not only of fire, but of insects and disease and drought. And all of that is going to, as you all know, only become more extreme as climate change and temperature continues and temperature rises. So there's only a certain amount of sequestering of carbon that we can do on the landscape. But one of the things that we can do is develop the forest industry that uses the wood that we want out of the forest and sequesters it. So not only for biomass energy, but there are new wood products such as cross-laminated timber and glulam in Europe, they're already building wooden buildings that are 20 stories tall. There is one that's breaking ground this summer that is funded by Beneficial Bank in Portland, Oregon, that is going to be 11 stories tall, made out of cross-laminated timber. And that sequesters carbon. So by thinning the forests, we can encourage the forest to sequester carbon more rapidly. Amount of carbon that goes into respiration then goes down. So you have more being sequestered, and then you can sequester it in the form of buildings. The carbon footprint of wooden buildings is far less than the carbon footprint made out of concrete and steel. Buildings made out of concrete and steel. One of the pioneers in this kind of building is based in Menlo Park. The name is Katerra. They have no interest in building in California because of the costs, because of the building codes, because of various other things. I think that those are areas that could be very productive for you to look at in terms of legislation.
Please see me.
That could
Miranda afterwards.
So we could use forest management, not only, we could use it to help mitigate climate change as well as adapt to climate change.
Yeah, your comment about using forest management with a portfolio to maximize the benefits that we achieve from the forest, at the same time we minimize the risks, is a really important one. And I think that an important theme from all you've heard here is that it's not just about minimizing the risk of wildfire, it's about managing the fuel, it's about encouraging the forest to hold as much carbon as they can, both on site and also off site in structures and other durable products. There's a question over here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Well, I only saw the one over here. We'll come over back here next. We'll have time for about 3 more questions, I think.
Okay, so, my name is Dr. Bob Bernstein. I'm the new health officer in Tuolumne County. Just a real quick background. I worked for the Centers for Disease Control for 30 years and had some experience in addressing issues associated with exposure such as volcanic eruptions when I advised FEMA during the Mount St. Helens eruptions hundreds of years ago. So I want to introduce a question as a consumer. I've just moved to Sonora, and I'm in the process of purchasing a home if the loan comes through. So, of course, I also had to apply for insurance. And as a consumer, what I found here in California is that USAA, which has been my provider of insurance for the last 40 years, refused to offer me insurance, and 2 or 3 other companies were also unwilling to do so, even though the house is located 10 feet away from a hydrant and no forest covers and so forth. So what I learned is that the local insurance company which would offer the insurance is not protected by the California, not sure exactly how to term it, I've forgotten the term, but there's a way that some of the costs that insurance company might realize could be handled by California's policies. So my question for the legislature is, what do we do about consumers who want to buy in the right areas and who need insurance coverage?
So I have the same problem. I only have insurance because I've been with Allstate for 50 years and I've been in the same home for the last 30 years. And when I try to go to another company, they will say, no, we don't want to take it. There is a program that's been around since the 70s that says somebody has to write your insurance. And if you go to the insurance commission, they can tell you, I can't tell you what the price is going to be, but there will be somebody who will have to write your insurance. Basically, sort of, there's for the privilege of writing insurance in California, you have to write to these areas. So there is a process, and for doing that, I don't know what it is, but again, you can talk to your local legislator, who can put you in, but just look for the California Insurance Commission, and they can tell you about the program. We are very concerned about the risk. One of the reasons, for example, State Farm doesn't want to write any more fire insurance is they had a regional office in Santa Rosa, so they have just been devastated because so many people in Santa Rosa had State Farm insurance, and they're trying to balance out their portfolio. Anyway, it's a big problem. It's one we're aware of. It's not one where there's legislation for solution. I think at some point, much as the state has gotten involved in being a backstop on earthquake insurance, we may at least have to be a reinsurer on fire insurance. And I can't tell you exactly how that's going to go, but I think it's something that we ought to be doing next year. Unfortunately, there's no legislation on it this year, but there's a clear need.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment on that example, and also what Dr. Horn brought up, that I think that highlights an issue that is getting less attention, which is just that there's a lot of potentially things that are beneficial to everyone, like you should be able to get insurance because your house is not in actually that fire risk prone area. And similarly, there's a lot of beneficial uses of biomass coming out, but there's a lot of kind of both coordination problems of like the biomass industry and needing certain minimum investment sizes, and also just bandwidth problems of organizations that are part of this process, where maybe if someone had time to evaluate your home in a lot of detail, they would realize that they could actually insure it. And I think that's true for a lot of these co-benefits, that there are a lot of small benefits distributed across a lot of organizations. So even when they are positive and non-negligible, they don't necessarily rise to the attention level of people who are stressed in these organizations across many responsibilities. So again, making it easier to do that is something that will hopefully help.
Okay, why don't we take one last question? And I see a hand here, and this is the first time I got over to that side of the room, so I didn't mean to be lopsided.
Sorry, thank you. Ashley Ames with the Legislative Analyst Office. I actually worked on the report that you referenced, and so Assemblymember Quirk, we have lots of ideas for you, and
Oh, good.
I'll reach out to your staff about that report. I guess my question is sort of what you see the role of the state being, especially when it comes to quantifying some of these benefits. You talked a lot about kind of coordination among stakeholders, but what are really our big barriers when it comes to specifically quantifying them, and what should the role of the legislature be? Should we be encouraging more research? Should we be doing pilots? I know, like in the McCalmy watershed, they did the cost avoidance study there that they thought was really beneficial in bringing people in. So is our role to kind of encourage that and let it bring stakeholders together and kind of move forward, or do you see it as something else?
Great.
I think that's for you, Ben.
Well, or Kari. Go ahead. Ben, you mind to start?
Sure. I think I haven't thought too much about that question, but I think the biggest issue is just making sure that when those types of analyses get done, that they actually don't run into administrative hurdles. So when academics or government policy analysts or NGOs are able to show kind of net social benefit to things, that you're not going to have so many administrative hurdles or just pure time challenges that those aren't able to be taken into account in decision making. So I think just streamlining, for want of a better word, but that's a quick answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, California's been a real leader in facilitating research and around climate change, and the California climate change assessments that have become an ongoing activity have been tremendous. And I guess you asked whether or not the legislature can support further research in this area. I think it's an area where we do need more research genuinely. I'm the professor saying more research, but so I'll live the cliche. But I think in this case, it really is true. I mean, we're hearing in the room some conflicting priorities, right? And I don't think that we know at this point actually how to quantify all of the costs and benefits, particularly the benefits of avoided costs, right? And so I don't know. I haven't heard that we know how to put the health benefits of putting a fire out sooner against the forest health benefits of letting it burn, and then put in the carbon part of that as well, right? So I think we actually do need to understand it better. I think California has been a shining example of how to get better understanding through the state legislature.
So the difficulty is we have a finite budget. And so you can say spending $100 million now will save you $1 billion down the road. The problem is, do you have the $100 million? And also, if it's a continuing program, then what happens when the next recession hits and we just cut everything? Do you really want to start another continuing program? I mean, I don't like that, but it's realistic that in appropriations, they're saying, well, typically the Appropriations Committee will get bills that cost billions of dollars, and they have to cut it down to hundreds of millions and tens of millions even, and then the governor will veto a lot of them. And we have a governor who doesn't like studies. Now you say research. Well, it's studies, and study bills have a way of either getting caught in appropriations because they know the Appropriations Committee figures the governor will veto them anyway. Now, maybe with the next governor, we can have more studies. But it is difficult to get this done, and part of it is that by its nature, the state budget is a one-year document, and that doesn't make a lot of sense when we're going to have to look at consequences 10, 20, 30 years down the road. That's the way it is now. If somebody could tell me how we can actually look out in the future and look at the fact that, and you will hear all sorts of arguments, some of which, a very good conservative Republican will tell you how you will get, if you could just make this tax cut, you will get more revenue down the line. Anyway, but you will also hear things like, if we really spent more money on preschool, we'd have fewer crime problems, we could close some prisons. If we could get good evidence for that, and if we could have a budget that really looked out 10, 20, 30 years, then I think we could do that. That's just a simple thing. I'll manage it next week, but I think that's what we really have to do to really see those impacts. And we do have, as you would say, structural problems in doing that because we don't look out beyond the current year.
Thanks so much. Oh, go ahead, Corey.
No, I'd like to say just, in terms of what can we do as citizens for the legislative bodies, right? To be able to provide, we might already have in our wheelhouse the knowledge to be able to say to what extent a controlled burn could affect the health of a community that's many miles away because it's actually done in a forest in the middle of Yosemite, right? Versus what would happen from the health consequences of wildfire that's not controlled. So we might already have that in our knowledge base. It's a matter of having a multidisciplinary approach of sharing that information and the communities making sure that they ask the scientists, okay, what would it take to be able to look at that and then provide that to the legislative body to be able to make an informed decision about do we do controlled burns or not. So things like this, it might already be available. It's really a matter of these multidisciplinary approaches that are community-based to be able to meet needs. And I think that's what we want to make sure that we do.
If you got it, get it to me now.
Let me just close with one thought. And we have an incredible abundance of riches in California in terms of the knowledge and commitment of our community. And I think what we've seen this afternoon is a really clear commitment to making progress in an incredibly complicated landscape that has legislative barriers, it has economic barriers, and it has scientific barriers. But I think the unique thing that we have that most other places of the world don't is a large number of smart people coming from different perspectives who are keen to share ideas and willing to confront a lot of these difficult barriers. I hope more than anything else that this conversation we've had this afternoon has been an important, contribution to next steps that will continue to unfold. And I want to do two things now. I want to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists who have made this possible. So Noah, Ben, Kari, and Bill. I also want to invite you to stay around and continue the conversation over a reception, not only with our panelists, but also with our Woods Institute Rising Environmental Leaders Program fellows who are at the back there. Anybody who looks like they're under 30 is probably a member of that program. And also, if you would join me in thanking the Wood staff who made this possible, Molly Field out at the front desk, Roberta Tugendreich in the back there, and Lee Rosenbaum.
And thank you, Chris.
Thanks to all of you.